like to call to order the July 10th council meeting. And Georgia, would you please call the roll?
Councillor Wong.
Present.
Councillor Rosenthal.
Here.
Councillor Nolan.
Present.
Council President Peterson. Councillors Gonzalez and Lewis are excused, and Deputy Council President Simpson.
Present. Good morning. Georgia, will you please play the safety video for our in-person attendees?
I'm Mike Reese, and I'm the Dive Safety Officer here at the Oregon Zoo, and safety is a big part of my job. Some of the things we consider here is diver safety. I'm out here at the Oregon Zoo, and you're at the Metro Regional Center. The council chamber is located on the 3rd floor of this building. In the event of fire or fire alarm, please exit through the door in the northeast corner of the room, go down the steps to the 2nd floor, and exit through the main entrance by the reception desk and gather in the courtyard outside the entrance. In the event of a medical or fire emergency, please call 911 and notify the security agent at the front desk. The nearest defibrillator is mounted on the steps leading from the reception desk down to Grand Avenue. Thank you.
I will now open public communications on non-agenda items. Georgia, will you please describe to the audience our procedures that we will use for public communications?
Yes, and Deputy Council President, for the record, Councillor Simpson has just joined. If you are testifying in person, please come up to the front and sign up.
You meant Councilor Lewis.
Oh, sorry, Councillor Lewis.
Yeah, I was like.
Every time.
Welcome, Councilor Lewis.
It's my first day. If you are testifying in person, please come up to the front and fill out a blue card from the back of the room and bring it up to me. If you are testifying on Zoom or by phone, please sign up by using the raise hand function in the reactions or more menus, or by dialing *9. When it is your turn to testify, I'll call your name or phone number. For those on Zoom, click accept to be promoted to a panelist. Your Zoom window will close briefly before you rejoin as a panelist. You can turn on your camera if you like. Testimony is limited to 3 minutes and the timer begins when you begin speaking. If you are testifying in person, there are timers located on your testimony table, on the wall, and on the digital screen. Please state your name for the record before testifying. You do not need to give your physical address. And Deputy Council President Simpson, we have one person who has signed up to testify in advance today, and that is Dexter Morgan. However, I do not see them on Zoom, and I do not see them in the audience. We can give them a moment.
Okay, give them a moment. All right. I will close public communications and testimony and move us along to our consent agenda. Councilors, we have 6 items on today's consent agenda. 3.1, resolution number 25-5508 for the purpose of confirming the appointments of Zipporah Newton Calvert and John Worley to the Metro Central Station Community Enhancement Grant Committee. 3.2, number 25-5513 for the purpose of appointing Brianna Bragg to the Future Visions Commission. 3.3, consideration of the June 5th, 2025 council meeting minutes. 3.4, consideration of the June 12th, 2025 council meeting minutes. 3.5, consideration of the June 17th, 2025 council meetings. And 3.6, consideration of the June 26th, 2025 council meetings. Do I have a motion on the consent agenda?
I move adoption of the consent agenda.
And a second?
I'll second.
It's been moved by Councilor Nolan and seconded by Councilor Rosenthal. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Yes.
Aye.
Aye.
The motion passes. Thank you. Moving along to our presentations this morning. We have 2 presentations this morning. First, we have 4.1 information technology audits results. We have 2 presentations from, well, first, I would like to please welcome Metro Auditor Brian Evans, who is here to share with us the results of the information technology audit. Welcome, Auditor Evans. And please introduce the team.
We'll get situated here in a second. Appreciate the opportunity today to present our audit results.
Take your time.
I'm joined by Maggie Muldrew and David Beller, who are two senior management auditors in my office, and we're here to present the results of our audit of information technology that was published last month. The purpose of the audit was to determine Metro's preparedness to implement the National Institute of Science and Technology's cybersecurity framework and to determine the effectiveness of IT governance for managing risks in 3 case studies. Before I turn it over to Maggie and David to summarize the audit results, I want to provide some background and context. Over the last 5 years, there have been several cybersecurity incidents at Metro. Those incidents heightened the need for business continuity planning to ensure restoration of critical services in the event of a cyber attack. At the same time, evolving business practices have increased flexible work environments. Employees now have more options for their work locations, schedule, and hours. These changes increase the need for more secure remote access controls. This audit assessed Metro's implementation of NIST cybersecurity framework. That framework includes 6 functions. The govern function is at the core of the other ones, and each of the other functions is dependent on it. A 4-tier rating system is used to evaluate each function. Ratings are used to identify the current level of cybersecurity practices and then make plans to reach the desired level. It's important to note that the highest level is not necessarily expected for all the functions. Organizations are encouraged to prioritize their efforts based on the areas of greatest risk and their desired level. This is sometimes known as setting the risk tolerance for an organization. I also want to note that in January 2025, we sent a separate letter to management that arose out of this audit work related to Metro's surveillance camera policies. We found inconsistent language in some of those policies increased the risk of noncompliance with Metro's records retention schedule. The letter also identified other control weaknesses related to surveillance camera use. In response, management summarized their plans to address the risks identified in the letter. And for anybody interested, that letter is published on our website. I'll turn it over to Maggie and David now to talk in more details about our audit results. Sorry, yes, please.
Not that I want a mic, but okay. Thank you, Auditor Evans, and good morning. As Auditor Evans mentioned, the first objective sought to determine IT's readiness to implement principles of the National Institute of Standards and Technology Cybersecurity Framework, which we'll refer to as framework throughout this presentation. Although some projects were underway to strengthen the identify, protect, and detect functions, without more progress in the govern function, it will be difficult to prioritize investments and proactively manage risks. We found that Metro had not set goals for cybersecurity. We saw gaps in current practices indicating some cybersecurity risk management and governance practices were underdeveloped. Setting a goal for the desired level could help stakeholders understand what to prioritize to address weaknesses. I'll give a brief overview of the 6 functional areas that we reviewed. For the govern function, although strategic planning and governance structures were in process, they were not fully developed. This, along with gaps in security policies, indicated governance was at the first tier. Under the identify function, an organization's current cybersecurity risk should be understood. Interviews with staff indicated an awareness of risk despite not having a risk assessment process. This led us to estimate a risk-informed level for the identify function. For the protect function, we learned that some vulnerabilities, like the need to create a co-location space for business continuity and risks related to the data center backup platform, were known. These were included in the list of capital improvement projects, which indicated a more risk-informed level. Detect was another function where the strength of cybersecurity practices were at the risk-informed level. We heard about user-based and system-based controls that were either in place or planned. According to the framework tiers, executing on incident response plans in an incident is one show of stronger cybersecurity risk management practices under the respond function. We heard that an incident plan was in process, but had not been completed. This led us to conclude that a lower level, partial, was appropriate. The recover function was another area where practices were on the lower end. Under this function, understanding roles and responsibilities along with executing a recovery plan were examples of a stronger cybersecurity practice. We heard from staff that not having defined roles and responsibilities has been a longstanding issue. Related to this finding we also found a need for clear communication about the status of projects related to cybersecurity. The current project-based alignment did not indicate how planned projects would affect current cybersecurity practices under each function. We also found that an assessment of organizational risk is needed to improve the governed function. We were told that IT was planning to develop a risk assessment process, but was hesitant to implement an agency-wide assessment without a policy to guide the process. Not having a risk assessment process appeared to limit implementation. Having clarity around the purpose could help decision makers understand their role and prioritize improvements. We found that prioritization of cybersecurity efforts was also needed to align resources with risks. Resources dedicated to IT security team were limited. Less than 10% of the department's FTE were assigned to security. We heard that one employee spent about 15% of their time managing framework implementation. We were told at that rate it could take 2 years to complete the initial implementation steps. Metro had 2 third-party IT assessments during fiscal year 2022 through 23. One addressed infrastructure and the other staffing levels. Since those assessments, IT spending increased. And according to staff, Metro is more secure today than a year ago because of those investments. Although we saw evidence of increased investments in IT security, we also heard of challenges with underspending, which could mean, despite the availability of resources, improvements were not always completed. We also found opportunities to strengthen cross-collaboration to improve implementation. The projects in IT's framework implementation were expected to be managed by multiple teams. Although projects were listed, planning documents did not include timelines. We heard of some timing estimates, but they conflicted. We also found similar inconsistencies when requesting descriptions of the work. 2 governance projects were already being managed by the Project Management Office. They were also managing the contract with a consultant to develop IT's strategic plan. Given the breadth and complexity of the framework implementation, increased coordination with the Project Management Office would be beneficial. One benefit could be alignment of cybersecurity objectives with IT strategies and goals at the enterprise level. Another benefit could be more efficient use of resources among project teams. This could also be a way to add capacity to cybersecurity efforts without additional cost. For these reasons, we recommended management clarify roles, responsibilities, and timelines for the implementation, develop a risk assessment process to improve implementation, establish cybersecurity goals for each function, and allocate resources to align recommendations 2 and 3. That concludes our review of the review related to Objective 1. I'll now pass to David Beller.
We also used NIST guidelines for the governed function to evaluate 3 case studies. We chose case studies with varying degrees of IT and cross-department management. The case studies were 1, timekeeping, which uses the UKG WFM system. Metro previously used Kronos. 2, multi-factor authentication, known as MFA. 3, software purchases with contracts and on purchase cards, also known as P cards. The case study showed strengths and weaknesses. 2 of the 3 case studies indicated governance was at the 2nd of 4 levels, which was slightly higher than our agency-wide assessment. Risk management was a weakness across the 3 case studies. NIST guidelines state that priorities and risk tolerances should be established and communicated to support operational decisions. The roles, responsibilities, and authority elements were in other areas that could be improved. Timekeeping system governance was in place with room for improvements. We rated governance of the timekeeping system at the 2nd of 4 levels. Policy and oversight functions were strengths. The shared responsibility of timekeeping management between IT, FRS, and HR could complicate governance. However, there appeared to be strong coordination, communication, and troubleshooting between the 3 departments. A stronger risk management strategy is needed in the timekeeping system. This could require improvements related to roles and responsibilities and contingency planning in the event that the system is down at some point in the future. The MFA case study showed that this technology is only one part of an effective system. We rated MFA governance at the second of 4 levels. Our assessment found elements in place for each aspect of NIST governed function. However, the system showed some weaknesses during the August 2024 cyber attack. Strengths included organization, defined responsibilities, and oversight elements. Oversight and troubleshooting were led by an IT work group, which established an oversight structure. Proactive governance is needed to keep up with this technology and learn from cybersecurity incidents. MFA appears to be a necessary cybersecurity protection, but Metro's MFA system was not sufficient to prevent a cyber attack in August 2024. Metro's experience with MFA shows that security tools can be undermined when used incorrectly by Metro employees. A fraudulent payment request resulting from the August attack advanced for several days before it was caught. More collaboration between IT and FRS might have reduced some weaknesses. Cybersecurity requires timely implementation, employee training, and clear organizational authority to be effective. In the software case study, we found that controls to limit software purchases were not aligned with current risks. We rated governance of software purchases at the first of 4 levels, which was lower than the other 2 case studies. Policies and procedures were established, but they did not appear to be functioning as expected. Vetting software purchases using the contracting process appeared to be underdeveloped. Contracts for software purchases had more controls than P-cards, but still had weaknesses. There was an established organizational structure and oversight had been assigned. However, in one instance, a department made an unauthorized purchase of software without IT, procurement, or the attorney's office approval. The lack of awareness by some directors and managers of policies and rules in this area suggests stronger governance is needed to manage risks. Metro policy prohibits or restricts purchasing software and P-cards. However, this policy was not enforced. Records showed that employees were purchasing software at an average rate of more than 1 purchase each day. Controls to limit software purchases using P-cards were ineffective, and we found governance in this area was weak across all 6 NIST elements. Clarifying what types of products fit within Metro's acceptable risk tolerances would be helpful. That clarity would state in policy what products are prohibited or allowed for purchase without IT approval. Revising the policy and increasing training would strengthen governance. Our analysis suggests that P-card holders may not always know what products or services constitute software. The frequency of software purchases on P-cards showed more oversight and training was needed to effectively manage cybersecurity risks. The audit includes 5 recommendations focused on strengthening information technology governance related to timekeeping, multi-factor authentication, and software purchases. Those recommendations include planning for a timekeeping system outage, implementing an MFA system aligned with NIST, ensuring staff complete annual cybersecurity trainings, and improving software purchasing processes. I'll now pass back to Brian to conclude.
Thanks, David. So that concludes our presentation. I want to thank the COO, the interim IT director, and all the employees on their teams that helped us during the audit. I also want to thank Maggie and David for their work and be happy to answer any questions you have now or wait until the management response.
All right. Thank you, Auditor Evans. Thank you, Maggie. Thank you. I just missed your name. Sorry. David. Thank you. I know we've come across a few times. Before we turn to questions and comments, I'd like to invite Deputy Chief Operating Officer Andrew Scott to provide the management response.
Thank you. Good morning, Deputy Council President and Council. My name is Andrew Scott, I'm Deputy Chief Operating Officer. First, let me thank the auditor and his staff for this audit on Metro's information technology. We greatly appreciate the issues they raise and highlighting of several areas where we can make improvements. Overall, management agrees with the 9 recommendations. Included in the written audit that you have before you is our response to each of those recommendations, and I'm not going to go into detail on each of them, but I did want to briefly discuss our proposed actions and timelines. As the auditor notes, the first 4 recommendations relate to implementation of the NIST framework. We are taking steps to align our cybersecurity efforts with NIST Cybersecurity Framework 2.0, define our key roles and responsibilities in the organization, clarify our governance structures, and identify implementation priorities. As part of that process, we do plan to do an organization-wide cybersecurity risk assessment, which is going to help us prioritize, help guide our prioritization and resource allocation. And once that work's done, we'll be able to establish cybersecurity goals for each of the functions, which is part of the recommendation. In terms of the other recommendations in the report, recommendation 5 asks us to create a plan to respond to a timekeeping system outage. As the audit notes, we had such an outage when our national vendor experienced a cyber attack in 2021. Well, we were able to respond and pivot to a manual payroll process and ensure that our employees got paid accurately and on time. This is not an ideal solution. We're working on a continuity of operations plan right now for timekeeping, and we do expect to have that completed by the second quarter of next year, 2026. Excuse me. Recommendation number 6 asks us to revisit our multi-factor authentication system to ensure it's aligned with the cybersecurity goals established as part of NIST Cybersecurity Framework 2.0, which we expect to have complete by the end of calendar year 2027. Recommendation 7 asks us to ensure that staff complete the annual cybersecurity training, which we agree is a very high priority. Every technology system is vulnerable to human error, as we see in cybersecurity incidents at Metro and around the world. Our employees are our first and last line of defense against these attacks, and we need to make sure that everyone is aware of their role in our cybersecurity framework. Recommendation number 8 asks us to ensure that employees are following our procurement policies and procedures around software purchases. Although our current policy does require IT approval for all computer hardware, software, and peripherals, we have not effectively implemented that policy to ensure that that is happening. We need to do a better job communicating the policy and then holding departments and employees accountable for violating it, and this is a top priority of ours for the current year. And finally, recommendation 9 asks us to create written guidance for roles and responsibilities related to the procurement of software contracts. And we do have a current practice in place of involving IT whenever procurement does involve software, but we do plan to formalize that practice into written guidance by the end of the current calendar year. I also want to note we brought on outside legal counsel that is helping us negotiate future software contracts for security risks. This is in light of some of the lessons learned from the Zoo data breach from last year. And finally, I want to acknowledge that Metro is going through a transition right now in its IT department, and that presents both risks and opportunities. As you know, our longtime CIO recently left Metro. Jeff Baer, who's in the room today, former Chief Information Officer for the City of Portland, has graciously agreed to come out of retirement to help us through this leadership transition. And we're soon going to launch a nationwide recruitment for a new permanent CIO to help lead this work into the future. And I'm excited about our prospects for finding a leader in this field who can implement the specific audit recommendations that we're talking about today, but also make Metro a technology leader among local governments. Cybersecurity is an ever-evolving field, especially with threat actors becoming increasingly more sophisticated in their attacks. We recognize that public trust is at the heart of Metro's core values, and we will continue focusing on investments that secure our systems and protect our data from these threats. Ensuring the safety of the information held by Metro is of critical importance. And I'll just close again by thanking the auditor and his team for reviewing this important area and helping to emphasize how we can improve cybersecurity and technology at Metro.
Thank you, Deputy Chief Operating Officer Scott. Counselors, any questions or comments for Auditor Evans or the staff? Counselor Wong.
Great, thank you, Deputy President, and thank you, Auditor Evans and team for the audit. Always very helpful and insightful. I think before I get to my main question, I was just wondering if maybe Deputy COO Scott or whomever, can you better articulate kind of the primary risks? Because I think we're trying to understand how much emphasis to put on the risks, I think, as the council. So like, are people trying to commit fraud and get taxpayer money? Do we have like privacy of like taxpayer data? Are people trying to use our processing power for whatever reason? Like, yeah, just, I understand cybersecurity is important, but what are the risks specifically for our agency and what are kind of the main things that people out there are trying to get from us?
Yeah, I can speak at a high level, and either today or in a follow-up briefing, we can speak about more specifics. And one of the things I do just want to note, and we really appreciate the auditor's sensitivity to this as well. This is a super important topic. We want to be very transparent about what we're doing well and what we're not doing well. We also don't want to broadcast to the world where our weaknesses are. And so one of the things that we try and be very careful about is when we do identify those weaknesses, we fix them. We don't necessarily, unlike other areas, I think, in government where we try and say, hey, look, these are our weaknesses we're fixing, and we don't want to provide a roadmap. So I say that as a caveat, and the auditor was very sensitive to that in the audit, which we really appreciate. We get thousands of attacks every day. And it would be, if you're interested, our cybersecurity head, Adam Carroll, can do a briefing. He does this for us on a quarterly basis and more frequently when needed. It's incredible, the amount of attacks that are coming in every day. And they really, they're from all over the world. There are some specific areas where they're more frequent, but they're really trying to gain access to our systems. And once they gain access to our systems, that allows them to do a number of things. You've mentioned it. Some of it's looking for fraudulent payments. Some of it's, potentially putting malware in place. We read about governments, ransomware attacks where they shut down, the entire government system. And those are incredibly disruptive. They're very expensive, and they're very hard to come back from. Again, we have a lot of redundancy in place, we have a lot of backups in place, and we have a lot of security screening to weed that out. But those are the risks we face every day. And I don't think we're not unique in terms of organizations facing that.
Great, thank you. And then in the auditor's presentation, there was a call for additional policy and guidance in this work. And is that guidance important to come from the council level, or is that something that the CEO's level can set that internal policy? What is the council action needed?
I think most of the policies and clarifications referred to here would fall under COO policies, and we go into a little bit of detail, a little bit more than I talked about in our written response in terms of making those. I think from a council's perspective, there are some resource and budget allocations. We actually this year, there is one-time money in the budget that you approved and adopted this year to help begin to make some progress on this. Over the last couple of years, you've actually made some significant investments in IT. The auditor mentioned some outside reviews we've done that showed that we really are under-resourced for an organization our size. And so we've been building up some of those things. One of the things that CO Madrigal in her budget this year proposed to you was not making reductions in IT. Well, we did make reductions in most of our other internal central services in order to help balance our budget and deal with some of our fiscal conditions. We did not make reductions in IT, and that was intentional in terms of not going back on some of the progress we've made. I think looking forward, we need to continue making some of those investments and then making sure that it's not just putting money to it, but it's putting money into the right places.
Great, thank you. Well, thanks for taking this so seriously. I didn't realize the scope of attacks we're under every day. Thanks.
All right, next I see Councilor Rosenthal.
Thank you, Chair. And I appreciate the questions that Councilor Huang asked. I mispronounced your name, my apologies. I think it's important to realize that there's a wide variety of risks, and they take a lot of different forms, and some of them are intentional, and some of them are just malicious, sort of, shall we say, undirected malicious. Two questions, well, a couple of questions. First question is, to what extent, this is a changing field. As AI gets more and more a part of our daily life, there's more and more risks that are associated with AI kinds of processes. Do we think that we can keep ahead of this, or do we think it's going to be catch up? And then one of the questions I noted, one of the issues was P-card purchases. And I was a little surprised it didn't just say enforce current purchase processes, because I think one of the conclusions was that the current policies are not being followed entirely. And so I guess, enforcing the current one would seem to be appropriate, as well as updating them to meet the current challenges. So that would be just a question of whether enforcement of the current policies will help, or whether we really have to totally rewrite and come up with new ones that we will enforce. And then, I will say, I'm not sure I have another question. I could think of a lot of questions, but those are enough for right now. In other words, what does the future look like in terms of adapting or keeping adapting to, continual AI challenges? And then to what extent do we have to rewrite some of the rules that we have? Or is it just a question of enforcing some of the ones we already have? And I guess the third question was, do you have an estimate of what level of staffing we need? You said we didn't reduce, which I think recognize that in the budget. Is that still going to be sufficient? Or are we facing challenges that we're going to need additional staffing in the future? Is that something we should be planning for?
Is that directed at us? I'll try my best on all three, but I might only get to two. In terms of the changing field and specific to AI or any new technology coming out, I think the way we're thinking about it is you have to have the foundation in place so that you can be nimble and responsive. So when you don't have that foundation, you're not only responding to the current risk or the event of the day, but you're also dealing with kind of a weaker structure from the start. And so I think that's why we're focusing a lot in our audit around that governed function, because when you strengthen that, when you have clear policies, when you have clear response mechanisms, when you have clear authority assigned, then you know if it's this type of threat or this kind of thing comes in, at least you can start and have a jump start on getting your handle on the specific incident. I won't speak to the AI policy generally, maybe management can speak to that. In terms of the P-card policy, the reason why we chose to kind of frame it as both an enforcement in the current world, but also thinking about what the current world looks like, really this comes down to evolving nature of what software is. So my understanding is that policy, the P-card policy, is really based on an old style assumption about how software gets used in workplaces. In the past, IT would be able to control the administrative rights to what goes on a physical computer. And so they had a lot more control over saying yes or no before an employee could use software. In the current environment, you can run most software through a web browser that doesn't require administrative rights on your machine. So you can run a lot more things. You can upload things to the cloud. You can distribute data and receive data in a wider variety of ways. And so the question that we're asking is, what does software as a service look like? That's what it's called when it's in the web browser, in terms of risks. For example, some of the purchases that we saw in P-cards are things like Zoom. Zoom is probably used by a fair amount of employees every day. I would personally say that that's probably a lower risk in software world and might be an okay use of software as a service. On the other hand, there's Dropbox, there's cloud storage where employees can upload information and may not be available to other people or may be available to folks that Metro doesn't want it. That might be a type of software as a service that is more risky and needs to be more tightly controlled. So it's really thinking through what the current environment of software looks like and not relying on it's either all software and IT has to figure out what the risks are, but really starting to think through what is the current operating environment of software. Okay. And for the staffing level, I'll turn that over to management too, because I think that's not exactly in our recommendations.
Yeah, thank you, Auditor. I think you nailed it around that policy. Yes, I'll say on the P-card one, I mean, just to be really blunt, this is a great example of how helpful these audits can be. I think we were aware there were some occasional policy violations, but I think the scope and scale of them that the audit team, found was surprising. And I think it really showed us both the need to enforce, but then also to clarify, when we say don't buy software on a P-card, what does that look like and how do we make that really clear? And yeah, it is a matter about enforcing the current policies around that as well. When it comes to staffing, I guess what I will say is we will return to you as resources are needed. I think we feel good about the current budget and the positions we have and getting those positions filled, some of the additional one-time money that'll help with this as well. But we will not hesitate to come forward with additional budget requests as needed for either staffing or consultants to move forward on this. And, to the larger question, around staying ahead of the game, that is the goal. It is very challenging. It is changing very rapidly. I don't know if CO Madrigal or if Sam Corder would like to come up and talk a little bit more in depth than I can about some of what's going on nationally around AI and those threats, but I'm happy to do that.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. I think this is a good opportunity to introduce a new addition to Metro, Samantha Corta, who recently joined us from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency with the federal government. She was the executive director of the Cybersecurity Review Board. I'm always tripping over that, I'm sorry. Was essentially the cybersecurity version of the NTSB. So we have incredible knowledge and experience now in-house, in addition to Jeff Baer's incredible experience at the city. And I wonder, Sam, if you could maybe speak to briefly just some national trends and if possible, in cybersecurity and how Metro might need to prepare for changes. Sorry to put you on the spot. Come on up.
Oh, yeah, come on up.
Come on up.
Come on up.
Welcome.
Thank you. I think, as we've said, it's an ever-evolving field. I think the most important thing, I think somebody mentioned it, is really getting a sense of our risks and vulnerabilities. Every agency has a different risk posture and risk tolerance, so there's certainly trends at different levels in different industries. So I'm a little bit put on the spot here, but I certainly would want to get a better sense, as Andrew said, of what are the things specific to Metro across the different departments and different capabilities that we have within the agency to say, what are our specific threats and vulnerabilities, and then how do we as an agency want to address those specific things? Because you don't want to overreact, but you also want to make sure you're putting in the resources in a way that you're addressing the things that are most important to this specific agency. You're never going to be on top of cybersecurity in the way that you want to. You're always going to be, doing a cat and mouse game. So, it's important to kind of assess your risk in a way that allows you to address it effectively. That's what I would say. I mean, I don't want to I'm not prepared to go through what's the latest right now, but that's how I would kind of give that answer, if that helps.
And
I think that's a great perspective.
That's good. Sam, for the record, could you introduce yourself and who you are and your title?
Sure. I'm currently operating as the interim office director supporting Marisa and the rest of the executive team. And then I'm also here to help look at and implement. There was a recent security risk and safety assessment that was done for Metro, and I'm here to kind of take the next step there, help lead that effort, which I believe strongly is also looking at our cybersecurity. So I feel pretty passionately about what I'm saying here, and I want to make sure I'm, providing the best answer.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Counselors, any other questions or comments for our lovely team?
I'd just like to say that I want to thank Auditor Evans and his team for doing this audit and for bringing up some very important issues that we will find continually challenging. And it's a very important thing to do. I appreciate it.
All right. Well, I want to thank you, Auditor Evans, staff, Deputy COO, for your continued work on this. And InfoSec is hard. I mean, it's information security. It's a hard world, and as Councilor Rosenthal put it, it's ever evolving, and AI is just the jet fuel that is going to keep it going. And so I just hope that we are in a posture to be proactive in the years to come. So thank you. All right. Next up, we have our state legislative recap. Our state legislative teams are back Metro Regional at the Regional Center after a long 6 months representing Metro and Salem. As every year, the team has prepared a recap of the session that reflects movement on our values and priorities. To provide an overview and answer questions, please welcome Annalise Curler, Legislative Affairs Manager, and Kyung Park, State Affairs Advisor.
Thank you, Deputy Council President Simpson. My name is Annalisa Curler. I am your Legislative Affairs Manager, and I use she, her pronouns.
And my name is Kyung Park. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm your State Affairs Advisor.
We are excited to be here before you this morning to talk a little bit about what happened these past 6 months down in Salem. Our presentation that we have planned for you today will do a little bit of an overview of the session, some framing in terms of big themes about what has happened, and then dive into specifically your priorities. I would say, overall, given, federal uncertainty and budget constraints, this was a challenging session for many partners, including Metro down in Salem. But I am also very proud of the work and the policy priorities of yours that we were able to achieve with our partners. Before we dive into that, I do want to start with a huge thank you. And that thank you goes to a lot of folks. While Kyung and I are here before you to talk about the legislative session, very much a lot of the work that we're going to talk about with you today was done in partnership, and it was done with the support and help of our department directors and other Metro program staff. I like to say that we are experts in the state legislative process, and that we are not necessarily experts in all of Metro's issue areas, and for that we rely on the deep bench and expertise of our departmental staff. And so a huge thank you to all of them who leaned in, sometimes late nights and weekends, in reading bills or helping us prep testimony, et cetera. And a real specific thank you to our Office of Metro Attorneys. I think, as you all know, the bill wording and exact language matters a lot. And we leaned on our partners in our attorney's office to really provide that expertise to us to make sure that we were reading things correctly and that the language reflected what we needed it to reflect. And then finally, I want to do a huge thank you to each and all of you. I know that a number of you came down to Salem to testify, came down for lobby days, made phone calls, testified virtually, wrote emails, and all of that. And all of that is a huge help in us achieving our priorities down in Salem. And then finally, the last thank you is to all of our partners. I believe that we have to do this work in coalition. And so a huge thank you goes out to our jurisdictional partners, business community, advocates, environmental organizations, community-based organizations, labor, really everyone who, we stood beside, stood in front of, stood behind in advancing these policy priorities. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kyung. Next slide, please.
So overall, this was a back to basics session. We didn't have an emergency housing package passed in the first 60 days. Committees kind of took some time organizing and only did informational hearings the first week of session. It really felt like we were back to sessions pre-pandemic, everything in person. Minus the construction ongoing at the Capitol, it really felt like we were back to normal. There were significant budget constraints this session. In about the last 10 years, this was the first time we saw a flat revenue forecast between the March and May revenue forecasts. This led to a lot of current service level budgets for agencies. For example, I think of in the lottery bonds, there was about $2 billion of asks with about $500 million in available resources. So many priorities and requests went unfunded this session. To further complicate the budget, the federal uncertainty and tariffs to possible programs, cuts to programs, made it more difficult for legislators to craft budgets this session. However, they decided to act on facts and not fear. Until those budget cuts were made at the federal level, the state had to proceed with a budget. So, they put together things as best as they can. Lastly, want to highlight that there was a record number of bills. I see 3,466 being quoted from the Senate President's office. This is about 15% more than the 23 session. What this ultimately led to, though, was some traffic jams in committees. Public testimonies were limited in duration, sometimes being cut short because of the amount of bills that really went through this session. In the end, though, over 700 bills and pieces of legislation were able to pass through this session. And we'll get into some of those in more detail here. Next slide. As a reminder, here were the state priorities. Like prior sessions, education, behavioral health, housing and homelessness were forefront in legislators' minds. Wildfires as well. Transportation was added this year, and we'll be going into a bit more detail about the package here in a sec. Next slide. And as a refresher, here are your legislative priorities that were adopted prior to session. We'll be going over each topic and some bills from each section next year. So next slide.
So the first priority that we want to discuss is economic prosperity. Some very good news on this front. Primarily in this area, we have focused on how do we get our lands development ready. And it has been a longstanding priority for Metro to find state funding for industrial site readiness. So that is the kind of bricks and sticks of infrastructure to make our employment lands development ready. We have been asking for this for over a decade, and really for the very first time, we saw the state invest money into this program. So we've had a program sitting there for over a decade. They have finally put money into it, which is great, and that is $10 million. To be clear, in 2023, they did put some funding towards industrial site readiness for the first time, but it was specific to the CHIPS Act and to semiconductors. So this money, this $10 million that they have done this session, is broader than that and can be for kind of all employment lands more generally. In addition, the state extended the brownfields property tax break, so that also has a new 5-year sunset on it, and also put $10 million into brownfields as well to recapitalize one of the brownfields programs. So really good news on that front, particularly in light of a constrained budget environment. While this was not necessarily on our official agenda, I did want to note that there was a kind of significant amount of funding that we saw Ways and Means co-chairs and the legislature really put into downtown Portland recovery. I think this is particularly of note, noting that there was such a budget constrained environment. We saw that the James Beard Marketplace received $10 million in lottery bond funding. There is some $3 million for the Tom McCall Waterfront Festivals, and in addition to that, the PSU, Portland Center for Performing Arts, received almost $140 million to build out their performing arts spaces. So again, the legislature, I think, really wanting to focus on downtown Portland and its recovery. Next slide, please. Gun safety. So again, some very good news on this front. This has been a long-standing priority for Metro for over a decade as well. And as I think you all know, there has been a current statewide preemption on local governments from being able to regulate CHL or concealed handgun license holders on their properties. We have been trying to lift that preemption alongside our local government partners for over a decade. I think oftentimes, frankly, we are negotiated out as a part of the gun package, and really happy to say that this is the session when we finally saw some real progress and got to see something come across the finish line. So in Senate Bill 243, there was a partial lifting of the preemption for local governments. Local governments will be allowed to regulate CHL holders in public buildings where official meetings occur. As you know, as is common, that bill was signed just a couple of weeks ago, and it will go into effect in about 90 days from now. And your Office of Metro Attorney and departmental staff leadership are really looking at that and trying to understand exactly how Metro could implement it if they could. So you will be hearing more from them about that in the future. Next slide, please.
In housing and homelessness, the legislature continued to address the housing shortage and our homelessness crisis in the state, really building off of the work from prior sessions. A couple bills to note. The first two establishes official programs, the shelter program of which is a result of a work group that Metro participated in during the interim. It also came with some funding to continue operations for shelters that were stood up from the emergency actions taken in the 23 session. The second bill I want to note was that last year you saw a direct allocation of housing infrastructure dollars go out to cities. This year, they actually established an official program at the Oregon Business Development Department, so that future monies can be kind of handled through that fund. I believe about $204 million was allocated towards shelters. The funding, because of those restraints, is spread out in a 10-year period, but that does give some breathing space this year for this next biennium. Senate Bill 684 was something that I think some of you had kind of received some communications from our partners. The bill aimed to establish a revolving loan fund for mixed-use multi-unit development. This kind of revolving loan fund typically needs about $100 million in capitalization to make an impact. Because of the limited resources this session, this bill was amended to direct Oregon Housing and Community Services to look at the feasibility and how would they implement this when funding is available in the future, but the bill also did pass. We saw a mandatory cooling for all bill, which would have required heat pumps or air conditioning units for all units or all buildings with 10 or more units to address kind of like the increasing heat events that we have in our region. This bill did fail though because it was an unfunded mandate and there were some concerns about affordable housing projects that are currently in development and increased costs to those. So as you can see, resources and funding had kind of gotten in the way of that. So we might have to come back in the future to see how that would work. Next slide. I also wanted to share with you some of the numbers and funding from bonds. To put some of this into context, affordable home ownership and the amount allocated for permanent supportive housing is actually the full amount that the governor and the housing advocates had requested. In the LIFT bonds for affordable housing development, the housing advocates had requested about $680 million, so pretty close to that in this budget constrained environment. We did see some deeper cuts when it came to preservation. The amount that was identified by the folks closest to this issue had said about $260 million was needed to address the upcoming expiring affordable properties. However, only $52 million was set aside. Of that $52 million, $2 million is actually set aside for manufactured housing parks. But I do also want to put into context that these are lottery bond dollars. There was only $500 million of lottery bonds available, and setting aside $52 million, nearly 10% of that is quite a big chunk of that. So, next slide.
Moving on to land use, I will say that this was an interesting session, that it was the first time in a long time in which you are not seeing a kind of large-scale urban growth expansion style bill on the docket for you. It was a quieter year on the urban growth boundary bill side of things. I think after the CHIPS Act and semiconductor UGB bills, as well as the expedited path for housing bills that have passed the past couple of sessions, I think there was a desire from the legislature and from leadership to maybe not discuss urban growth boundaries for a minute. However, I do want to flag one success that was, I think really important to Metro and important to our land use team, and that is House Bill 2356. This was a Metro-sponsored bill that would really ease some the annexation processes that we have. I think, as you all know, Glenn is in front of you with some frequency, bringing in metro properties for annexation. There is some property that is inside our UGB that is not inside our service district boundary. And we, through House Bill 2356, have found a way to streamline at least for some of those properties. And that is when those properties are not yet inside a city. And when a city goes to annex them, this bill combines the annexation properties for metro and the city. And I just want to say had relatively smooth sailing, particularly for a bill that contained the words annexation, metro, and urban growth boundaries. Next slide.
In Parks and Nature, we have some good news in recreational immunity. Last year, there was a temporary recreational immunity established that actually sunsetted this year. However, that sunset was lifted and the protection of recreational immunity has been made permanent. So that passed this year. We also supported some additional funding for abandoned RVs. HB 3209 would have raised registration fees on RVs, and that increase would have funded abandoned RV cleanup. This concept was actually folded into one of the drafts, one of the final drafts of the transportation package, and was we thought was well on its way to find some additional funds for abandoned RVs, but ultimately the transportation package failed. Therefore, the additional funding for RVs failed. Next slide.
Transportation. I'm going to spend a couple minutes in subsequent slides going into a lot more detail about the transportation package, knowing what a significant priority it is for you all. But before we jump into that, did just want to highlight a couple of other transportation priorities. There was a Senate Bill 715 that would have created the High-Speed Rail Task Force, and that ultimately did not get across the finish line, and neither did the TV Highway Transit project funding for $50 million. I think both of those, frankly, were unfortunately due to the budget constraints that the legislature was facing. And I think in particular, when you have a transportation package year, while that package was not supposed to be focused on projects and ultimately was not focused on projects, there was, I think, a feeling from many legislators that there was this giant transportation package, and shouldn't any transportation priority be funded by that? So I think you had that additional wrinkle as well. The one significant piece of funding I did want to flag that did see its way across the finish line was interstate bridge replacement project funding. As you'll recall, last biennia, the legislature committed to their $1 billion to match Washington's $1 billion in investment for that project. The legislature has laid out a plan to pay that in installments at $250 million a biennia. They did the first in 2023, and this was their second payment of 4, and they did indeed obligate $251 million in general obligation bonds for that project. So that is moving along. Next slide. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time really talking about the transportation package and what really unfolded during session for that. And in particular, did want to start with a little bit of framing. And I think it's important to understand that really going into session, there were two kind of main pieces that really framed up the conversation and that are important to remember in the context of this package. And, first of that is really this concern around cost of living and affordability of tax increases in this moment. I think you all know that is top of mind for many of your constituents, and it was top of mind for many of the legislators down in Salem. And then I think the additional overall framing is just a reminder that while I think transportation is incredibly critical in this moment, it does not necessarily rise to the top 3 or top 5 issue for many Oregonians. It is not what folks are hearing about in their town halls or necessarily on the doors as much as some other issues like housing and homelessness. And I think that is important contextual framework as legislators were walking in. The additional piece that I want to flag, that different than other transportation packages, there was a very strong desire for this package to not be focused on projects. Typically, transportation packages are filled with projects in which legislators can go back to their districts and they can say, this is what we're getting for our tax increase. It's this bridge being rebuilt. It's this highway going in. It's this road being fixed. As I know that you are all aware, we in Oregon have a significant issue with operations and maintenance funding. And then that really was the focus of this package. And it is because it is what is needed. And I think that makes it a more challenging thing to sell, to the paving of roads, the fixing of potholes, the building of sidewalks. It's a little bit harder of a message to sell, I think, to constituents. During the 6 months that we were down in Salem, there were a couple of things that we really did also hear very clearly from the Transportation Committee around some of their frustrations that did, frame, I think, the package and possibly its ultimate failure. We saw deep frustration with ODRA around the project cost and scope increases and some of the accounting errors. So I think there was a feeling from some legislators about a lack of trust in that agency to deliver, and what were the pieces that needed to be put in place to feel good about sending more money their way. I think we also heard some concern from some legislators about what we call 50-30-20, which I think, as you all know, is that transportation funding is split. Historically, state highway fund money is split historically between state and local governments. I think we heard from some partners or from some legislators that legislators were about to take a tax vote in which 50% of the funding would go to another entity, and not loving that in some ways. And then I think, in kind of an addendum to that was this frustration that they had with local governments not stepping up themselves to provide funding for transportation. That is less about our region. I think that, a number of our counties have raised passenger registration fees to fund transportation. The city of Portland has a gas tax. Like many of the communities in our region have stepped up, but I think throughout the state there was some frustration that the state was really carrying that burden for local governments, and that was a theme throughout the conversations. And then finally, I do just want to flag that, as this is a top priority for our council, in 2017 we saw really the first time that the state invested in transit operations and maintenance, and I think there was a very good effort this session to increase that funding that ultimately made it into bill drafts. But we did hear some, frankly, lukewarm support and at times opposition for the state funding transit. So that was definitely a theme that we heard. Next slide, please. I do want to talk a little bit about House Bill 2025 and how it aligned with your priorities and JPAC's priorities. I think it's important. I know the bill ultimately failed, but I think it's important to understand what was in the bill in order to understand, what went wrong, and also to know that we do believe that House Bill 2025 will likely be the framework for the future for a possible future transportation package. It has become kind of the rough draft. There were ultimately two versions of House Bill 2025 that passed out of committee. There was a larger version that passed out about a week before the end of session that was pretty large and wholesale. It was about a $15 billion package. I'll go into some details in a minute. And then a couple of days later, the bill was referred back to committee, and then really just a scaled down version of that bill then also passed out of committee. And I would say that overall, in both bills, what we really saw was a reflection of the priorities that you and that JPAC set for the transportation package. We saw increases to gas tax, vehicle reg, title fees to really stabilize our state and local governments in the short term. We also saw commitments to how do we get on that long-term sustainable funding path. The initial bill that passed out has had mandatory road user charge or VMT program for electric and hybrid vehicles. This was in both bills. Ultimately, in the first bill that passed out of committee, there was also a pegging of gas tax to inflation. So really trying to put our transportation system on that long-term sustainable funding. Finish What We Started refers to the House Bill 2017 projects. These are Rose Quarter and 205 Abernathy. There was a funding commitment in both bills to provide funding to finish those programs. Safe urban arterials and streets was in both bills at pretty substantial funding amounts for the Great Streets programs and for safe routes to school. So again, the legislature really meeting that commitment. Transit funding was in both bills, increasing the STIF for the Statewide Transportation Improvement Fund, the funding that goes directly to transit, was an increase to those was found in both bills. I will say resiliency was less called out specifically. We did not see as much funding for EV infrastructures or EVs, although there were some arguments made that some money could be spent in different ways to get at that, even if it wasn't called out specifically. The other thing that I just want to flag is that in the final day of session, when it was clear that neither bill had the votes to pass, there was a last minute attempt that was led by the governor, in particular to pass a very small, well, I guess it depends how you look at it, a 3-cent gas tax increase and some increases to passenger vehicle registration and title fees to just provide funding for ODOT. That was universally opposed by a number of our local government partners, by environmental orgs and others, transportation advocates, just feeling like that was not really the path. And that ultimately did not pass session either. Next slide. So in thinking about where we go from here, I want to talk a little bit about some of the impacts that I think you are all aware of, some that are being felt really immediately. I'm sure that you have all read the news about the ODOT layoffs that have happened. There is also news from our partners at the City of Portland about layoffs that will happen as a result of a transportation package not being passed. I think for some of our other partners, those budget impacts will come in the kind of next fiscal year. I think some folks built budgets off of a transportation package passing. Some folks built budgets off of not assuming that, but we're hopeful in future years. So I think we will continue to see the impacts of that for our other partners down the road. There continues to be conversations about the possibility of a special session or addressing a transportation package in the short session. And I think those conversations are, ultimately really just ongoing. And I think what's really framing up the conversation in this moment is that, if the overall challenge really is this affordability issue and the cost of living and how much can Oregonians afford in this moment to pass something that ultimately is really about maintaining and in some moments improving current services. What does the package look like? Does it look like even more scaled down effort? So like everyone, like all parts of the components of House Bill 2025 just take haircuts? That was, the attempt that I think the legislature did with the second option of the bill they put forward, or is it a package that actually cuts components? So some of your priorities are that we want to see are they just not tenable as a part of a larger package? And I think those are really the conversations that we will be having moving forward about what that could look like. You could argue that the governor's attempt at the end of session was obviously very clearly about cutting components, and that also did not ultimately pass. So I think we are trying to figure out what the path is forward on that. With that, I will move to the next slide.
In waste management and reduction, our battery extended producer responsibility bill ultimately failed in Ways and Means. There was quite a bit of effort and a lot of support behind this bill, so definitely something that we'd want to bring back in short session. We are also tracking the statewide food waste bill. It was basically taking what we have done here in the metro region and applying it statewide. This bill also contains some components related to date labeling for food and maybe got a bit too complex and died under its own weight. And lastly, there were a few bills introduced throughout session that were attempting to make some changes to the Recycling Modernization Act, which is set to go live this month. There was an effort from newspapers or just getting some products exempt before launch, but all of those bills ultimately failed, and now the recycling RMA is ready for prime time here sometime this month. Next slide. Some other bills outside, or I guess tangent to our legislative priorities. There was another attempt to make some changes to local income taxes. This bill in particular would have required all local income taxes to comply with state tax statutes. This would have impacted our SHS tax by not allowing certain pass-through and exemptions and things like that. So we, along with our partners, Multnomah County, Clackamas County, Washington County, and City of Portland, successfully opposed these efforts and will continue to do so to make sure that our local income taxes are protected.
Two other final bills to flag for you. One is House Bill 2977, and this would have raised the state's transient lodging tax, and it would have directed that funding to wildlife conservation. As you can imagine, this bill sits at a complicated intersection for Metro. Our efforts at the Oregon Zoo mean that we have been and are continue to be deeply supportive of any efforts to support wildlife conservation. However, the revenue stream that was identified for this is challenging for our folks over at the Oregon Convention Center and our ability to continue to attract conventions. That bill ultimately, in the final days of session, did not make it across the finish line. And then the final bill, wanting to end on a really high note, was one that we were not anticipating, but I think is very positive, and that has to do with our folks over in our venues in P5, and it has to do with event ticketing transparency, so that kind of all-in pricing and whatnot that we've seen come down from the feds as well as really trying to crack down on misleading marketing tactics. So the bill ultimately gets rid of unauthorized or misleading uses of venue logos, branding, website names. So now hopefully when you go to purchase some tickets from the Keller or whatnot, you're not gonna have a website pop up that makes you think you're buying tickets from the Keller when you are in fact not buying tickets from the Keller. So I think a really big deal for P5 and others. Next slide, please. That concludes our prepared presentation for you. We are here to answer any additional questions you might have.
Okay, thank you so much, counselors. Any questions or comments for Annalisa or Kyung? Councilor Rosenthal.
Sure, I have a couple questions. First of all, I see two options regarding what's happening with transportation, either a special session or wait for the roads to get so bad that it becomes a higher priority. Do you see any other options? That's one question. And then it is well known that this area, this region, has special transportation uses. Special transportation needs much higher density and much higher needs than the rest of the state. And we're more than 55% of the state in terms of usage, and certainly higher in terms of freight uses, and certainly higher in terms of, vehicle passage on bridges and so forth. Is there any realization or idea in the state legislature that some special funding mechanisms for the metro region might be necessary so that the rest of the state does not feel, which they sometimes do, that we are impacting what they get? In other words, their roads are in jeopardy because of funds that go to Portland.
Thank you, Councilor Rosenthal, for the questions. I mean, no, I think you've, to your first question about, is it a special session or do we need to wait for things to get bad? I think you've hit the nail on the head of kind of the two major options that are really in front of us. It's a special session, or waiting till short session, or ultimately, honestly, waiting till 2027. In which case, I think folks would feel the acuity of the cuts, particularly from ODOT, from a statewide perspective, and then in our region from PBOT in particular. So that might spur some additional action. And I want to be clear that I do believe that what we saw this past session was a strong commitment from legislative leadership, around passing a transportation package. I think that is why in the last week what you saw was multiple attempts to get something across the finish line. That was really demonstrative of their commitment to try to figure something out, to try to get a transportation package across the finish line. And then I think, to this question about the unique needs of the region and a kind of region-specific tax or something like that, I think that there could be appetite for that in the legislature. I do think that if there is, I would hope that it came from an ask from our region and an organized ask from our region. I do think that the journey of tolling over the last couple of years probably makes some folks in our region, as well as some legislatures, a little weary of some sort of metro region specific tax, because I think there are those that believe that that was what tolling was meant to achieve.
Thank you. Yeah, the term I use is segmented VMT, or TO double hockey sticks.
Thank you, Councilor Rosenthal. Councilor Wong, and then Councilor Lewis.
Great, thank you, Deputy President. Thank you both for all your hard work. I know it was a long and exhausting 6 months. Two questions for me. First, in transportation, you were talking about how various agencies prepared or didn't prepare for whatever outcome might happen with the transportation package. For our region, TriMet's been pretty quiet in terms of potential cuts. Like what's coming up for our transit partners here in our region?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you for the question, Councilor Wong. My understanding, and we need to get more information from TriMet, but that they built their current budget for this year that we're in, not assuming that there would necessarily be a transportation package. So I think at least for this year, there are no cuts, but in future years, I think there will be cuts without action.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
And then I'm looking at the numbers for housing production, like 468 million for lift bonds. Seems like there are some high numbers here, but I'm wondering how close that was to like actual need, or what the governor's task force on housing production asked for. Or governor, like, these are some big numbers, but
yeah,
does it hit the mark, or how short are we in our production goals?
Thanks, Councilor Hong, for the question. I would say the numbers are pretty close. So on that slide, you might have been out of the room when I went over this, so I'll just kind of quickly go over it again. As far as homeownership and the permanent PSH, those were actually fully funded from the governor's budget and from the housing advocates. In lift bonds for affordable housing development, the request was 680 from the housing advocates, 700 million from the governor's office. So I would say 468, or where it landed, was actually quite in line with kind of how everything else was kind of cut across the board across other funding requests. I did highlight that in preservation, the need identified was 260 million, but 52 was funded this year, 2 million of that being for manufactured housing parks. This one was a little bit more tricky because these are lottery bond dollars. There was only 500 million available in lottery bonds. So that is, a pretty big ask from a smaller pot of money. Hopefully the 50 million or so will be able to address the dire expiring properties, like the ones that are like in the next 6 months or so, and we can come back for additional requests.
And do we know? So I saw the update from our federal affairs team, and it seemed like there was an expansion in low-income housing tax credits, and with with these investments, do we have a sense of the scale of production that might be on the table now for Oregon?
I don't have an answer for you for that at this moment, but yes, the changes of the federal government for light tech and such will have a different additional impact of this. So we'll have to kind of see where everything lands. So we can get back to you on that.
Yeah, it'd be great if we coordinate with housing and see how much we anticipate now. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Wong. Councilor Lewis.
Sure, thank you so much. First, cheers. We have the best local government affairs team in the Capitol. So thank you for making it through the session with your professionalism, your diligence, and your ability to speak to such a wide variety of issues, since we do intersect with so much. And frankly, we're not only there on behalf of the region, the constituents of the region, but also our jurisdictions. Not all of them have lobbyists in the room, and you've been helpful to be eyes and ears for the cities that don't, and that maybe don't always get what they need out of their state association. My question, well, I have one more remark. I think in the heat of the end of every session, there's always the wave of disappointments because there's never enough money for everything. But I would just note that this year felt noteworthy in the amount of disappointments from the session. And despite really nobody getting what they wanted, it's nice to be able to see our end of session report with some sunshine. But in terms of the budgeting process, I believe I had heard a couple of conflicting things around squirreling money away for the inevitable cuts to Medicaid and other federal cuts. And can you speak to how much of that strategy they've funded, and if they plan to use e-board or legislative days or special session to work through backfilling the federal cuts?
Councilor Lewis, thanks for the question. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but what I can say is there was money set aside for potential federal funding cuts. And also there was money set aside to put into the rainy day fund. I think at one point, some of the housing advocates looking at some of the cuts that they were facing were trying to advocate spending more and not squirreling away as much, but the legislature did at the end decide to set those funds aside. I'll have to get back to you on the actual dollar amounts that were set aside for it. And, there was talks about a special session if there were federal actions that were taken. So we'll have to see if that realizes down in the next couple of months.
I think two additional things on that. One is I think it's really important to understand the size and scope of federal investment in Oregon. Is it about, like, the state's budget's a third federally funded? So just knowing, like, if there are substantial federal budget cuts, the state cannot backfill that. And that is just the reality of the numbers. And I think the other thing is, and we can get Betsy up here or send an email about this, but just a reminder that many of the provisions in the latest bill that passed out of the federal administration do not go into effect until 2027. So some of this might not require necessarily urgent action of a special session and could be resolved in short session or frankly in the 2027 long session, depending on the program. So some just additional context there.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Councilor Lewis. Councilor Nolan.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. The issues have already been fully vetted and discussed by my colleagues. I just want to add compliments to the team for their ability to track an incredibly wide variety of bills and to be up to date on the content of potential amendments or issues, and also the dynamic happening in the legislature at the time. We could not have been served better, and I appreciate your diligence, your insight, your energy, your optimism through some pretty dark days. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome.
Appreciation. Councilor Nolan. Councilor Rosenthal.
Yeah, if I didn't do it before, I also want to echo the chorus, join the chorus, and thanking you for an excellent job keeping track of all this stuff, as well as keeping us informed in a very practical way, and for your frank assessments of things. But I one real quick question: where did the numbers for the industrial site readiness bond end up? How much was ended in that pot?
$10 million.
Boy, that's not going to go very far, is it?
Correct. The coalition asked for 40 and has a number in the need category that is, kind of surpasses 500 million. So yes, but to be clear,
It's a start.
It's a starting point, and it's the first time in over a decade that they've actually put money into the fund. But yes, it will not go very far. That is correct.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. All right. Are y'all done with comments? Seeing it? No further hands. Thank you both. I think, for your diligence, hard work, hard conversations. I think Annalisa and I had weekly conversations during this session. But all in all, to Councilor Lewis's point, there was some sunshine that poked through. So I really want to just continue to commend the both of y'all. Y'all are down there. Y'all are really doing the hard work. You and your peers across agencies. I see how y'all interact and that dynamic, and we're a stronger region because of that. And so thank you.
Thank you.
All right. All right, Chief Operating Officer, Communications.
Thank you, Deputy Council President. Just a couple of things today. One, we are monitoring some high heat index forecasts for next week for a couple of days. And so we'll have a facility closure check-in on Monday and see how things are shaping up, but just something to be aware of. And then I also wanted to share a few upcoming events at Metro sites. Next Friday night, Zoo Nights concert is this July 11th with Kalimba, the Spirit of Earth, Wind, and Fire. In addition to the concert from 6:30 to 8:30, there's also a variety of activities, including, wait for it, a bubble dance party, lawn games, a performance by Dragon Theater Puppets and Princesses, and a variety of keeper chats and animal activities. Zoo Night concerts are every Friday during the summer from June 20th to August 22nd. So plenty of chances to take in the zoo, even if you can't make this one. Tickets for tomorrow's concert and all the other Zoo Nights are available on the website. I also wanted to highlight the return of Music on Main, which is the free outdoor concert series. Music on Main takes place on Main Street next to Arlene Schnitzer Concert Hall between Southwest Broadway and Park Avenue, and features popular local musicians that play a variety of styles. The concert series kicks off on July 23rd from 5 to 7 with an ABBA tribute band after midnight, and continues Wednesday evenings through August 13th. So that is a free event series. Tickets are not needed. Just wander up to Main Street. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Councilor Communications. Councilor Lewis.
Just wanted to report back that the Tri-County Planning Body met last night. Agenda items included both a report back from me about the president's work group and our decision as a council not to advance a measure in November. We also talked about and actually approved the TA technical assistance and training plan that had budget attached to it out of the RIF. And then the last agenda item was discussing pay issues for service providers. It was a good meeting.
Excellent. Okay. Seeing no further discussion, the council meeting is adjourned, and our next regular meeting is scheduled for Tuesday, July 15th, 2025 at 10:30 a.m.